Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Disruptive Innovation Festival. This is a festival where we ask the question, what if we could redesign everything? This is the first live show of the second week. My name's Joe Murphy. I manage the C100 network here at the Foundation. We're joined by Lewis Dartnell.
Hello.
And my colleague, George Millard,
Hello.
who is the software guy at the Foundation.
Thank you very much.
Lewis is an astrobiologist and the author of The Knowledge. The Knowledge is a how-to guide of how to recover post an apocalyptic scenario. And Lewis has brought with him a box of tricks that we'll be talking through today. Do chip in. We've got some questions directly for you, but do come feedback to us with any comments that you have. You can ask questions and get involved using the hashtag ThinkDiff or using the discussion forum below this screen. So, Lewis, this is not your typical apocalypse narrative. And essentially, it seemed to me that you're exploring how disconnected we are from our stuff today and technology and how things are made. Can you give us an example of what you're talking about here?
Yeah, so in essence, the whole reason I've been looking into this is as a science writer, is researching this thought experiment behind the knowledge of how you could go about rebooting civilization from scratch. But at the end of the day, the book's got nothing to do with this post-apocalyptic scenario, the sort of like Mad Max or The Last of Us or I Am Legend kind of tropes we're all familiar with seeing. And I thought that scenario, that kind of notion of the loss of everything that we take for granted in our everyday lives. Like, imagine waking up tomorrow and it's a kind of a post-apocalyptic scenario. So you've lost everything that we use in our day-to-day lives.
Looking a bit like that.
Looking a bit like this, and kind of nature's reclaiming the kind of cities which are kind of falling back down to rubble. So let's imagine we found ourselves in this. We woke up tomorrow morning and that was outside your window. And the question now would be, well, what next? When you can no longer rely on civilization to do everything for you, how could you do things yourself? Like, our great-grandparents had a much better idea of this, but we've kind of lost a lot of those skills now, that knowledge and that understanding, and we're quite reliant on other people doing things for us, just walking down a high street and picking something up from the supermarket when you get peckish, but not really knowing where that food comes from.
I can relate.
So I thought
absolutely.
Well, exactly. So I thought the good way of exploring how our world actually works, the kind of science, the technology, the understanding, the knowledge that underpins everything we do, imagine it disappears tomorrow, and then answer that question about how would you build it all back up from scratch again to get back out of this situation and recreate a kind of a technological civilization for yourselves.
Yeah, I mean, for example, imagine if there were no more razors.
Well, the three of us would probably not look all that different.
Very patchy representation.
I don't think razors would survive post-apocalypse. They're very flimsy.
No, good. Well, we're prepping. We are preppers here,
Well,
so
exactly.
we're prepared for that. I watched one of your talks before coming on. You gave a really interesting example of a pencil. Do you mind just double downing on that, because I really enjoyed it?
Yes, the idea behind this is that a pencil's like the simplest tool, implement that you're ever likely to use in our day-to-day lives. You reach for it without thinking twice, scribble something, a shopping list on the back of an old envelope. But the reality of the situation is not a single person on Earth that knows how to make a pencil. Like, no one person that knows how to make a pencil. Because you need to get the wood for the kind of outer sheath from a forest in a particular way, and then mill it to create the kind of outer layer. You need to know where to go to find the graphite, the kind of writing lead in the middle of the pencil. You need to go where to get the metal and smelt it to make the bit on the end, and kind of the rubber comes from somewhere else. So the pencil is this simplest thing we use every day of our lives, not really thinking about. It still embodies this incredible infrastructure and network around the entire planet of different people having different subsets of knowledge about where to go to get this, how to mix this with that to get the third thing, how to combine different things together and make something even as simple as a pencil. And now imagine the problem of, could you make like an iPhone or a smartphone from scratch? Like, you can kind of intuitively get how a pencil works. There's something soft in the middle and it leaves a line or mark when you kind of move it around. But if you open the back of a modern laptop or phone, there's not this clockwork back there. You get no idea of how it actually works. Like, the circuitry is invisible to the human eye. It is microscopically tiny. So that's why I think we're kind of losing this connection with the technology we use every single day of our lives.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I wouldn't even open the back of my laptop. I mean, George, you probably would, because you're a bit much more technology enabled than me. But just the very thought of that would be, unnerving because
Well,
I
they try and put
wouldn't
you
wanna
off doing
break
it, and you
something.
can't even change the battery in a modern phone. The modern manufacturers are disincentivizing you from interacting with the technology and understanding how it works. And so that's what I want to try and explore. By kind of imagine it disappears, how would you go through those steps to bring yourself back up?
Now, I know the point of this is not to get into the nuts and bolts of how this happens, but in your opening, you did mention Mad Max, you did mention I Am Legend, you know, and for the preppers out there who are fascinated by this, you did also reference that there is a good way for the world to end, and this is a thought experiment. So can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah,
What is the good way?
So let's say I would give you both a menu that you got to choose from of what apocalypse was about to happen tomorrow morning, but you know you're going to survive that apocalypse. So what end the world would you most want to happen so you have the best chance of surviving and then recovering and rebooting civilization from scratch? And what I would pick, I would definitely recommend you don't pick something horrific like a nuclear Armageddon or a big asteroid strike, because the world would be left in such devastation afterwards. You'd have very little chance of recovering after that. And actually the best way for the world to end, as it were, kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek, would be some kind of global pandemic, some kind of virus that rips through the huge population of humans on the world today, kills off the most of those, and so you've survived with a small population, but all the stuff is still there. You can scavenge and forage for what you need during this kind of grace period as you work out again how to make things, how to do things, where to go to get what you need from the natural world, and kind of pull yourself back up by your own bootstraps. Whereas if there was like the kind of Mad Max scenario where like technology's collapsed, we ran out of oil, or there's been some kind of coronal mass ejection or EMP pulse and these sort of things that preppers talk about again, the technology has disappeared. You've had that rug pulled out from beneath our civilization's feet, but all the people are still there. And then you've got like this Mad Max situation where civilization has collapsed, but there's a huge number of people, kind of fighting like rats for the dwindling resources that are left behind. That would not be a good way to have any chance of trying to recover. And
It's quite a hard choice, though, isn't it? I'm not sure what I'd choose: roaming gangs of maniacs or
machete-wielding
zombies.
gangs.
Yeah,
Everyone seems to wear too much tight leather, it seems. So the whole kind of Mad Max trope, I get this kind of like self-sufficiency and kind of every man, kind of woman for themselves. That's kind of a particular quirk of these post-apocalyptic films. I can't be dealing with all that tight leather. Why would you change your wardrobe?
It's a sexy topic.
And you've got to look good while you're surviving the world.
You do.
And George, on that, you have a question for our audience.
I do. I have some questions for our audience to get us in this post-apocalyptic mindset. Question number one, and actually we're going to be posting these or asking these to Lewis. He's going to answer them at the end of the session as well. The first question, we want to know what you think is the most likely cause of the end of the world as we know it. Do be creative, so zombies if you want them, aliens if you want them. I'm thinking artificial intelligence, but have a think about it and please share your thoughts with us. Question number two, this is a good one. Imagine you're in this, we're going to go with zombie apocalypse. I'm sorry, we keep talking about
I don't
zombies.
mention the Z word a single time in the book.
We're going to go into the realm of science fiction over here. Lewis is going to sit a little further away. But imagine you are in this say, a zombie apocalypse. 3 questions. First of all, where would you go if you had the choice of going anywhere on the planet? Secondly, if you could take just one person with you, who would you take? And there's no need to be sentimental about it. And thirdly, if you could take just one item with you, what one item would you take? So those are my questions to you, the audience. Please have a think about it. Share them with us. You can share if you use the hashtag ThinkDiff, or if you log into your MyDiff account, you can go onto the discussion forum at the bottom of the session page. So share your thoughts with us, and we'll be discussing those with Lewis right at the end of the session. Thank you.
So Lewis is working on his
I was trying to think very quickly.
Making your plan.
Shot on the spot.
So Lewis, this
You
is...
don't want me to choose between the one of you two to be my one guy to say.
Who would you take, Joe or George? Joe or George?
I mean, there's no question.
I think we both would.
Yes, okay, so there's a scene here. Something's happened here. Clearly, this is an apocalyptic scenario, and we've got kind of nature seems to be overgrowing in our cities again. Can you set the scene for this thought experiment? So it's an I Am Legend scenario. We still have a lot of the infrastructure. We have a drastic reduction in population.
Yeah.
What else has been happening in this picture?
Yeah, so the starting point that I picked for this thought experiment of how would you reboot if you ever need to, and I should immediately point out that as a scientist and astrobiologist, I have no knowledge that this is about to happen. I haven't spotted some asteroid heading our way. This isn't, this isn't some massive marketing ploy for trying to push up book sales. But I thought that the best starting point for a thought experiment to make it a clean question that you could then explore through the course of the book what the answer to that might be, how would you reboot, would be something like this. Like I say, that you've had a collapse of technological civilization, of this industrialized, glittering skyscraper cities world that we live in today, with electricity and antibiotics and internal combustion engines. And for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day what it was, what event, what doomsday occurrence there was to collapse all that. But it has happened. And there's a small community of people that survived, and this is what their worlds might look like. And that the cities are getting reclaimed by nature. And I mean, this is almost identical to what a place like Pripyat would look like, which is very close to the Chernobyl disaster, where humans have been excluded because of the radiation, and it's just booming with wildlife. Right, there's trees growing up in the middle of buildings, there's lots of kind of deer kind of reclaiming areas that they would have been excluded from otherwise. So this is the kind of scenario, that kind of landscape that we would find ourselves in. And what I've been trying to explore is, how would you move on from this? How would you start recovering everything from the ground up? How would you navigate through that network of knowledge and kind of scientific understanding and technology and innovation, which this festival is all about, to plot some kind of shortcut route from, you know, the beginnings, 10,000 BC, to the modern world of electricity, antibiotics, internal combustion engines, wind turbines, all these things that we kind of use
rely
today.
on.
Yeah.
And so you've painted us a picture there, and you're saying this is the recovery to form Civilization 2.0, which you call it in your book. And you say that Civilization 2.0 will look a little bit like steampunk.
Yes.
And I've never heard of, I'm not a sci-fi guy, but I've never heard of steampunk before. What do you mean by that?
Oh, so steampunk as a genre of literature, of kind of sci-fi books, is kind of counterfactual history. Let's imagine there been some change in the last couple of hundred years and history played out slightly differently. And the kind of archetypal example of steampunk would be lots more airships kind of making it through the Victorian era, or kind of steam-powered robots, or that kind of mismatch of technologies from different ages. And it's this whole kind of trope and aesthetic of things that are kind of anachronistic from each other, from different eras but coexisting. And I was arguing in the book, in the knowledge, that that's exactly what you'd expect as your community or society tries to recover, because you wouldn't have to repeat history exactly the way we did it the first time, when we stumbled across scientific understanding and different experiments and discoveries randomly. With the idea behind the book that was directing you and instructing you how best to recover, you could accelerate that, you could take shortcuts. You would maybe make almost kind of Dutch-style four-sail windmills and not use it to grind grain for making bread, as we did originally, but you understood electricity now, so you could use that to generate electricity for yourself. You could have this kind of, like I said, this kind of anachronistic mismatching of different technologies. So in this Civilization 2.0, I said it's playful, right? It's this kind of thought experiment. It wouldn't look exactly like the original trajectory we went through. You could take shortcuts, you could leapfrog over stuff and recover as quickly as possible.
Can I just chip in with a question? Have you got a sense, when you talk about taking shortcuts and recovering as quickly as possible, in your mind, how long we might be able to recover? In say, the ideal scenario, we've survived the apocalypse, we've got a copy of your book. How many hundreds of years, how many generations do you think?
It is a great question. It's a question I kind of avoid answering numerically, giving a particular answer to it, because it is so dependent on exactly what apocalypse happened, whether it was a nuclear war or a pandemic, how many people have survived, what kind of skill sets and knowledge people have. You wouldn't want to be on a survival team with a bunch of accountants and creative directors, right? You want to have software developers or authors. you want carpenters, you want nurses, you want blacksmiths, you want people with practical, hands-on skills. But the idea was that with the right knowledge that was preserved, you didn't have to go through another dark ages like after the collapse of the Roman Empire. You preserved that knowledge, it wasn't lost, and you could then exploit it and put it into good use. You could maybe recover in a couple of generations, maybe a century or so.
Okay.
That would be the hope anyway.
That's promise. Yeah. So if it takes longer than that, everyone, we know who to blame.
Come blame me.
Yeah, send him an email somehow.
Give me a telegram once we reinvented electricity and the electric wire.
So it sounds like with this kind of steampunk, where we're being inspired by what we know technology can do now, but then we're limited by what we can actually do in the absence of all the kind of digital technologies
Yeah.
that maybe developed over time. And it seems like now we were saying just before this, we might be more vulnerable than ever because we are so over-reliant on these technologies that are really practically quite impossible to reproduce, if in that scenario, in the scope of generations. You talk about some gateway technologies, some technologies that are really important for just really exploding what could be possible. Have you got any examples you could share with us?
So I'd say I've brought a little wheelie case of kind of objects and artifacts with me. So when I was writing this book, it wasn't just a library project and blatantly mining Wikipedia for all this information that would evaporate as soon as the grid went down and the internet disappeared with the apocalypse. So I did do a lot of reading, and the kind of bibliography of the book, something like 500 references there of books I've read, and going right back to kind of 1700s and the very, hands-on, practical, pragmatic information that people were recording about how to smelt metal and stuff. So I referred to all of that. But I also wanted to be really sure that I was talking from first-hand experience. I was doing these things myself, so I can then describe how you would do them for real in the book. And one of the things that I did, and one of these gateway technologies you want to get back to as quickly as possible to allow your society to flourish and recover, would be something like the printing press. The printing press is one of these gateway technologies. And in our own history, before the invention of the printing press, it's almost as if there was like a chokehold on society, that only rich and powerful people got to choose what was allowed to spread, what ideas people were allowed to share, what knowledge was allowed to be transferred. Because the only way of copying a book would be to fill a room with scribes, with people handwriting that book letter by letter.
And that was a job,
time consuming.
right? I mean,
And that would be your job for life. It was often done in monasteries and other kind of concentrations of people. You would spend your life copying text a letter at a time. So books were fabulously expensive. They're very, very rare. And with the invention of the printing press and like movable metal type printing, it's almost as if you can now, with a flick of a switch, mass produce human ideas and human thoughts and share them amongst everyone who would want to read them, once people kind of learning how to read as well. And so I argue in the book that the printing press, one of these gateway technologies, it's not really kind of scientific discovery or technological invention, although it's sociologically transformative. It helped build the modern world. And in the book, I realised that I could explain, in these kind of back to basics ideas, how to make your own paper from scratch, how to make your own ink, and how to construct your own primitive, rudimentary printing press. It's almost as if, within the pages of that book, of the knowledge, it's kind of got the genetic instructions for its own reproduction. So tongue-in-cheek, again, the playful element of this, is that if only a single copy of the book has survived this apocalypse, it knows how to replicate itself, how to reproduce like an organism, and you can copy that book into however many versions you need for kind of everyone that's survived in your community. And to just put my money where my mouth was, I did that.
This is the proof.
This is the
Proof in the pudding.
This is 2 pages from the book. So there's the title page, and this is the page from the knowledge that explains how to make a primitive printing press, printed using a primitive printing press onto handmade paper. So that
you
page
made this
there.
paper.
I made this, and,
Yeah.
we worked with a let's say a kind of primitive
Yeah.
1700s printing press. It wasn't quite as simple as kind of Gutenberg's very first one, but it's kind of just simple metal machinery with a press kind of screw that you turn to push down onto the paper.
Which
so
in that scenario would survive. It would still be.
or would be a very simple thing for you to make yourself.
Right,
Like I
okay.
say, it's kind of simple mechanisms. So that there is an example of the book replicating, reproducing itself like an organism. I love that as a concept. So the printing press would be one of these gateway technologies you want to get back to as quick as you can to then accelerate everything else from there.
And in a way, I mean, the printing press has been linked to kind of the birth of the
Renaissance and the scientific
progress
revolution,
came off the back of that. And your book, I mean, there are other examples. The encyclopedia is quite a famous example of a book that contained all knowledge that existed in the world at one time.
And they genuinely could. So the encyclopedia that Denis Diderot wrote in the 1750s was a genuine attempt to record the sum total of human knowledge. It was kind of a total book. Everything that was known by everyone around the world, they tried to record in this book, and they had series of almost kind of cartoon graphics, like this is how you weave a fishing net, and this is how you would have made the string to weave together, and this is where you'd gone to get the sisal or the fibre from plants. So the whole step from this is how you go into the natural world, and you do this, and then this, and this, and then mix that with that, and you've now got a fishing net, you can now feed yourself. And one of the specified reasons in the introduction to this encyclopedia from the 1750s was to store and preserve and protect human knowledge in case civilization collapsed in the way that the ancient Greeks did and then the Roman Empire did. And you'd want to have that kernel of everything we've worked towards so far, so that people afterwards could refer to this encyclopedia and it would all kind of unflower and unfold from there.
Your guide's a bit more practical, would you say?
It's a bit more concise. It's not an
shorter.
entire volume
26
series.
volumes of, yeah.
But it's that same concept, the same idea of boiling things down to the very essence, so you can do the fundamental stuff and then fill in the gaps from there.
And so communication's really important, storing knowledge, sharing knowledge, really important. Yeah. What about just making stuff work? You know, the kind of mechanization of things that we really rely on today, from things like cars driving around, planes flying around. That's maybe a bit far-fetched, but what are some simple examples of
so the other example that I brought along that we can kind of, in this kind of show and tell talk, was what you'd really want to avoid happening in this post-apocalyptic society would basically be this. So again, I love this photo. It's one of my favourite photographs in the entire book. And the guy here is looking particularly smug with himself because let's be honest, he's built himself a Mad Max post-apocalyptic chariot.
It's a chariot.
He's got a car and he's chopped off the useless front engine, the bit with the engine that isn't working anymore because you don't have access to crude oil anymore, or petrol and diesel we would find from it, or you don't have enough spare parts left. They've all rusted and decayed and you don't know how to make them yourself with smelting and machining precise parts. So he just chucked away the useless engine end of the car and kept this kind of rear axle to make himself a chariot, which he's hitched up to a draft animal, to oxen or horses. So you would want to stop your society in this post-apocalyptic scenario from regressing hundreds of years into the past of using muscle power to do stuff rather than engines and machinery. You don't want to ever have to go back to breaking your own backs if you're quarrying and mining and making things.
All the horses. He doesn't look very happy in this.
I mean, the horse, it looks pretty content with its lot, but there's a limitation in society there because you have to feed horses as well. So you have the choice, do I feed humans, do I feed horses? It takes up a lot of land. And this is why the Industrial Revolution happened. We realised we could dig up energy from underground, from ancient forests of coal, invented the steam engine, you burn the coal in the steam engine, and you've got artificial muscles. You've got things that are incredibly productive and powerful and don't need to be fed and kept alive and cared for and tended, and you can make phenomenally fast transport, things like trains and ships now. So the question is, how do you do this without petrol and diesel? Can you run a car, machinery, without crude oil?
And now the big reveal.
And the big reveal is, what I've brought along is how you can do that. So this is a gasifier stove.
Which looks like a big tin of baked beans or something.
This was chickpeas in the bigger one. So you've got a big outer tin can, a smaller tin can in the middle there. And as you can see in the kind of schematic diagram here, one's inside the other, and I've punched a load of holes in the bottom of both. And to run your gasifier stove, all you would do is put a bit of newspaper, some kindling, some twigs in the bottom, light it, and because you've got air holes at the bottom, you draw through this nice current of air, of oxygen, to get a strong fire, nice intense combustion going on inside that, which is just like any barbecue. There's nothing special about that. What is unique about this gasifier stove design, even this really primitive tin can stove, is you've got a second row of air holes right at the top. So after the wood is broken down in the heat of its own fire, it breaks down, undergoes pyrolysis to give off lots of gases and vapours and smoke, which is itself combustible. You then reintroduce oxygen to that mixture of hot gases and burn all of that. These things are incredibly efficient. I did have mind to show you that live in the studio, to demonstrate this gasifier stove. Yes. I was told, no, I've learnt the hard way not to try and do that. So I did a TED talk.
If you can't see, we do have a wooden
It's roof. A lot of wood around here. So I was asked to do a TED talk a couple of years ago, and trying to demonstrate this gasifier stove, I came about that close to setting fire to my own face, because I'd forgotten just how much hairspray they put in my head during that talk when I was on the big red spot of doom. I've been sat next to Monica Lewinsky in the makeup chair, getting incredibly nervous, trying to strike up a conversation with this person sat next to you who's probably also feeling quite nervous as well. And the only thing I knew about her was the one thing you'd probably never raise in polite conversation.
yeah.
So we sat there in silence.
Okay.
And I forgot how much hairspray they put in.
Safety
So
first, I think.
safety first, almost set fire to my own face. So we'll not be doing that live. And instead we've got a video which we can roll on here of this gasifier stove in operation. So I filled it with a bit of newspaper and just a tiny handful of twigs. And you'll notice that it smokes a little bit when it's first burning. And when I put this little chimney, just made out of other tin cans, bang, within 4 seconds, that smoke has disappeared and it's been replaced by this 4-foot jet of flame coming out the top of this gasifier stove. It's incredibly efficient and effective at making use of that fuel that you've given it. Just then was when I almost lost my face.
Just that when you
Top
lean forward to
top
look.
life hack, top pro tip, do not lean over jets of flame when you have lots of hairspray in. So you can really see that jet of flame being pumped out the top of this tin can stove, this gasifier stove. And when we zoom in, what you're seeing there is actually jets of flame coming out from when those air holes are reintroducing oxygen. That wood itself isn't actually burning. There's a clear gap above the wood before the flames are now appearing and then kind of rising up, because the wood is undergoing that gasification process. And this gasification process is used, again, a lot in modern technology, like entire power stations in Scandinavia are run by burning wood. They have lots of forests, using that gasification process.
That's today, right?
This is today.
Right.
This is the here and now. Using that gasification process to turn wood into gas, which you can then burn very, very efficiently in your electricity turbine. And then they take all of that spare heat once you've made electricity and like boil water with it to heat people's homes and run their showers and baths. So it's like 90% efficient power stations. This is very forward-looking, green technology, kind of eco-thinking way of kind of joining up the dots, the systems thinking we were talking about earlier. What you can also do, and linking back to our post-apocalyptic scenario about how you could keep cars running without petrol, is you can also take your tin can gasifier stove, scale it up from something the size of an old baked beans can like this, scale it up to something the size of a dustbin, strap it to the back of a car, and you can run a car using wood as fuel rather than diesel or petrol. This is the gasifier stove on the back, the wood's breaking down to give off those gases under pyrolysis. You pipe them over the roof of the car, down to the bonnet, inject them into the engine cylinders, and only then allow that gas to mix with oxygen and explode usefully to drive your car forward.
That looks entirely street legal.
So we were talking about like kind of steampunk technology. This is what I would say. This is just a khaki mess of things bodged together, kind of strapped on. It looks like some kind of Mad Max steampunk crazy contraption. But these things work perfectly well. They run on wood as fuel. And actually during the Second World War, with all the fuel shortages back then, because we got very good at blowing up each other's oil refineries, there were over 1 million gasifier-powered cars, wood-powered cars, driving around the streets of Europe, like looking exactly like this, using that kind of that slightly simpler technology.
That reminds me of another example from your book, actually, from the Bosnian War, where they were using, I think it was water-powered or pedal-powered electricity generation in a local. I don't know if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I didn't put that picture, that graphic up on the screen here, but this is a city called Grazda, and they had been completely surrounded by the army. This is a modern city that had been essentially isolated from the rest of the world, but they were resourceful, they were ingenious, they were inventive, and over one of the main bridges going over the river, they hacked what we would call like kind of makers and kind of hack spaces kind of nowadays. They built these wooden water wheels, which they float in the river, tethered to the bridge, and the great big kind of paddle wheels turned. And to transform that movement, that rotation into electricity, they scavenged something from under the bonnet of any car you could find lying around in Grazda or in this post-apocalyptic scenario, which is the transformer. And they used a transformer to generate electricity. They then passed down wires to the riverbank to recharge batteries, to run lights at night. And again, it was a wonderfully kind of fulfilling and kind of energizing example of just everyday people being ingenious and inventive and bodging stuff together to just keep things going. And I thought alongside the gasifier car, these are great examples of how we could go to a slightly simpler state and recover society after the apocalypse, or to use that as a mirror for looking back at our own modern world. Just, kind of peering behind the curtains a little bit about how things work behind the scenes.
I mean, it's really interesting that, there are examples where people have applied this, it's not super far-fetched, it's happened.
It's not hypothetical, no. This is not, like I said, this isn't like post-apocalyptic sci-fi.
This was real.
All the examples in the book are kind of real examples in history.
I have a question that's coming from the audience, which I think is relevant to this. So the question is, in all the systems that you looked at, water, energy, the chemical industry, mobility, etc., as you embark on rebooting these systems, would you do some things differently the second time around? And is there something we can learn from this when looking at developing countries? And this sense that here, and in your scenario, we wait until necessity drives us to simplify and do things differently. So actually, if we can get into this creative space, can we do things differently before we need to? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so to pick up on the developing nations example is a cracking one. And again, a lot of the examples I used when I was researching and writing the book are what are known as intermediate technologies or appropriate technology. So how do we help bootstrap the less developed nations to start attaining kind of standards of living that we again just take for granted in kind of Europe and the Western world and developed nations? How do you kind of fill in those gaps? How do you kind of leapfrog them forward? And the sort of technologies that we use, the kind of things like the gasifier stove that we mentioned. A gasifier stove is something you can make yourself. It's incredibly efficient when it's running. So it makes very good use of the firewood that a family can collect in a day in kind of sub-Saharan Africa. The fact that it is perfectly smokeless when it's in operation means you're not breathing that smoke into your lungs. So a huge health concern in developing nations is breathing in wood smoke. So you burn the wood smoke in your gasifier stove, you cook your dinner much more effectively and you don't get all the health issues. Another example is a kind of, again, kind of fun, but in a very real world sense, kind of life hack for how you could ensure that the water you're about to drink after the apocalypse or in the developing world today is not going to kill you. It's not laced with cholera or typhoid. And this is a technique called SODIS, or solar disinfection, which again is being touted, is being taught by the World Health Organization around the developing world. And in order to use science, use modern knowledge to ensure, to know for a fact that your water is safe, that it's clean and not contaminated, is just put your water into an empty plastic bottle and then leave that out in the sunshine. And because you've essentially constrained that water to be very shallow within the plastic bottle, the ultraviolet radiation, the UV rays in the sunshine can pass straight through, kill or inactivate any bugs, any bacteria, any pathogens in that water, and you can come back to it a day or two later and know for a fact that it's safe to drink. So there are 1 million people a year that die today, even today, from things like diarrhea, from really easily preventable diseases, and tricks like that use kind of second-hand things or things you can scavenge yourself are making a huge difference in the developing world today.
That's sunlight
with these appropriate
and
technologies.
plastic bottles, specific type of plastic bottles.
Any plastic, so glass doesn't work because glass blocks UV. So you want a plastic bottle. You probably want like a kind of small bottle like this, not a great big kind of 3 litre, big vat of it. You don't want it to get too deep because you don't want the UV to be absorbed.
Like the width of the bottle as
it's
well?
the depth of the water, it's the width of the bottle, exactly.
It's the how much water the light is passing through.
Exactly that.
So that the UV light isn't absorbed by, say, the outer bit.
Exactly, because in a river and a lake, the bacteria will be kind of moving around, so they won't be exposed to UV for very long. So if you force them to sit in that UV zone, they get killed, they can't repair their DNA, they die.
Wow.
You drink that water and you've kind of hacked your way to disinfect that water without, kind of a centralised system.
I feel like we're becoming more useful.
I feel like I should be
useful in
taking notes, taking notes
by the minute.
Remember the thing about the water.
Remember the thing about the water. So just to remind you of the question that George asked earlier, Samantha Choi has an answer to that question, just to seed us for some to encouragement for those of you out there. Samantha would go to Burlington Bunker near Corsham. She'd go with Mike Tyson. And she'd take lots of tins of baked beans.
Well, there you go. You wouldn't get bored of baked beans for the rest of your life?
Well, you'd have to split the baked beans with Mike Tyson.
And
it'd be a 50-50.
And yet, no tin opener.
Oh, so quick hack tip. If you go to the book's website, which is here, the-knowledge.org, there's a short video of how you can open a can of food without a can opener or any other tool at all. There's another really nifty life hack of how you can pop off the lid of a can if you've forgotten to take one into your bunker with Mike Tyson.
I will be checking that out because my tin opener is appalling at home. Geraldo asks, did the person in the swivelly chair wear orange socks on purpose so that he matched his chair? Yes, I did.
Yes is the
Geraldo.
answer.
That was always going to be the answer. Thank you for being so observant. Okay, so other gateway technologies, other things that we could use. You talked about the scientific process and how that is a technology in itself. That is a bit bamboozling to me. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so looking at these kind of transitions or major hurdles in our own history, and looking at how you could leapfrog to them and kind of accelerate recovery. Back in the kind of early 1500s, there was the scientific revolution. People started to be much more systematic and methodical about trying to understand the natural world around us, and then exploiting that new understanding to make new technologies, to improve our lives, to have inventions. And in order for that scientific revolution to occur, in order to have science, in order to be able to build the modern world that we do in today, you need a particular material. And it turns out that there is a single material with a unique combination of properties without which you cannot do science, without which you can then not build the modern world. And this material, the special, almost magical material, is relatively strong. It's chemically unreactive. It doesn't alter things you put in it. It's not altered by them. But it's also perfectly and utterly transparent. And there's only one thing you can make. There's a combination of all those three attributes. And that is, of course, glass. With glass, you can make test tubes to understand about reactions and chemistry and actually see what's going on. With glass, you can make a thermometer to measure temperature or a barometer to measure pressure. You know, these are just tools to measure the natural world, understand, spot patterns, and kind of understand how that works, and then invent the kind of steam engine a bit further down the line. But most importantly with glass, you can manipulate light itself. You can make a lens. You can focus that light. You can build a microscope and see things which are invisibly small and understand about germs and bacteria and why people get sick and what diseases are. Or you can kind of look out the other way and make a telescope and start seeing things that are very, very far away and discovering the kind of universe and cosmos around us. But you need glass to be able to do that. Glass is the fundamental material. So again, as one of these kind of like fun weekend trips that I went on.
You've had so much fun. I think you've had so much fun writing this book. Yeah.
I tried the kind of ultimate Robinson Crusoe experiment. So it turns out that the three ingredients you need to make glass with, you can get on the same beach. You need silica or sand. You need soda or potash, something that acts as a flux to help you melt that sand, which you get from seaweed, burning seaweed. And you need lime, which you can get from chalk or kind of limestone or coral or seashells. So you can get all those things from the same beach. So I went to a beach. It was one in Norfolk. It was windswept and drizzly and grey and horrible. But I collected all those three things.
That's unimaginable.
In a day. I got the sand. I got this glasswort plant which concentrates soda ash, sodium carbonate, which you use to help melt the sand. Here's me looking very chuffed with myself. Windswept hair, just coming back from the beach, and finding some chalk, kind of half a mile back inland. Grind those all together, mix it into a powder, put it in a hot place, put it into a kiln, which you made very hot by using fire. We've already talked about how transformative fire is as a fundamental process in society. And melted that glass, and I've brought that along for you here.
That's in pretty good nick.
This is, you can have a look at that. That's my Robinson Crusoe glass from scratch on a beach in a day. And if you notice, you've got that kind of nipple right in the middle of the glass. You know, from like in kind of an old pub or kind of ye olde England kind of restaurant, they'll have window panes with a kind of little dimple right in the middle.
Yeah, very small panes.
Exactly. Yeah. That comes about because you make a pane of glass like that by glass blowing. You get a blob of molten glass, blow down a metal pipe to inflate it, and then kind of squash it flat again. And when you break off the glass blower's pipe, you're left with that dimple. Right. And we've since invented a modern way of making very, very flat, very smooth glass by basically floating it on molten metal. But as a simpler way of making glass, you get that little kind of dimple from the blower's pipe in it. But again, I was astounded just how transparent and clear. It's got a little bit of bubbles in it because we didn't leave it in the kiln for slightly long enough.
Actually.
But it gives it a bit of an aesthetic appeal. So those would not be great for a pair of spectacles or a telescope or microscope lens. But I say we've learnt our lesson, and this is the kind of process of constant refinement and improvement. I know what to do next time I go back and improve on that and just leave it in the kiln a little bit longer to give those bubbles a chance to
The
escape.
shaping of that, did you have to do much to get
yeah.
that shape? It's incredibly smooth. It looks...
So this is just a blob of glass.
Okay.
You get a globule of glass that forms in the bottom of your clay pot in your kiln.
Mm-hmm.
You stick in your glass blower's pipe, you inflate it, you blow it up into a glass balloon, and then kind of squash it flat again. So you inflate it to make it thin and uniform, and then squash flat again to get a pretty uniform pane of glass. And you could cut that if you wanted a square piece. You could use a bigger dollop to make a bigger pane of glass.
A bigger dollop.
Bigger bollock.
Bollock.
Bigger dollop of glass.
Bigger dollop. Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. I think if the book sales don't work out, I think you've definitely got a career in
Sidelining
arts and crafts.
Yeah.
In East London, people will be paying fortunes.
Hipster glass.
Yeah,
there you go.
that's what you need. Yeah. So I think we're going to cut to George. You've got some messages for our viewers.
Indeed. Brilliant. All right. So I'm going to take just 2 minutes of your time now to give you 3 of my recommendations for other sessions that we have here at the Diff that I think you'd really enjoy. And they all link in one way or another to Lewis's talk here today. So recommendation number 1, this talk is called What If We Trusted You? It's by Jerry Michalski, and it was shown last Friday. So it's available on Catch Up. And Jerry gives a really interesting talk on the value of trust in different systems, whether they're commercial systems, educational, or social. So I think this is perhaps relevant for Lewis's post-apocalyptic society as it works on rebuilding itself. I really enjoyed the session, so I'd highly recommend it. Recommendation number 2, this talk is called The Biggest Revolution in 3D Printing is Yet to Come. Again, it was on last Friday. It's available on Catch Up. And in this talk, Alicia tells us all about the amazing advances we're seeing in modern 3D printing. And it made me think, what if a sophisticated 3D printing machine survives in Lewis's post-apocalyptic scenario? And how might that impact how quickly we can recover our lost technology? So something to think about there. And recommendation number 3. Now, for me, how can we talk about the apocalypse without talking about artificial intelligence? So my 3rd recommendation is a talk about AI. And it is called How Humans Can Thrive When Machines Are Smarter Than Us. And it's by David Weinberger. Now this one will be shown next Monday, that's the 20th of November at 8 p.m. And David's going to give, I think, a really interesting talk about what it means to be human in a world where machines are significantly smarter than we are. I think it's going to be really, really good. So I'd recommend checking that one out as well. So those are my 3 recommendations. Please, we've had some brilliant comments to our questions. I've been sitting here trying not to laugh a couple of times as I read them, so thank you for that, guys. We'll get to those later, but please keep your comments and your questions coming in. And remember, you can join the conversation on Twitter using #ThinkDiff. That's all from me. Let's get back to Lewis and Joe. We can carry on with the rest of the session.
If you haven't picked up on this by now, I think you'll notice that George is got a bit of a soft spot for artificial intelligence. I don't know if a soft spot is the right word.
It's an underlying fear. If the world's going to end, there we're meddling with forces that are beyond our understanding.
Lewis, any comments on that?
Yeah, I hope the AI revolution doesn't come and wipe us all out. This is the kind of Terminator scenario, isn't it? And again, if we're thinking about sorts of apocalypse you would want to survive and then try and recover, do not go for Terminator. Do not go for the AI overthrow.
That would be the worst.
What would you do afterwards? Yeah. There's now something replaced us as the dominant organism that we wouldn't be able to recover back into.
That's true. At least we'd still be top of the
organic
food chain.
Oh, that's if you're ruling out alien invasion, which we haven't had yet as a suggestion, but you never know. The thing, if I can just briefly chip in with how we think about artificial intelligence and its potential to cause devastation, is that whenever we think about it or talk about it, we go straight to Terminator and we almost rub our hands in glee and say, oh, brilliant, it'll be just like Terminator. And we don't seem to be able to separate how terrible it might be in order to think about it in a rational sense. So, yeah.
But also how wonderful AI might be. So I'm a huge fan of the Ian M. Banks books and his culture series.
Fantastic.
And the minds.
Yeah.
That they are benevolent, almost omniscient and omnipotent. They're godlike minds. and they kind of nurture humanity, and they
they
go off on their own
maintain,
adventures, and they kind of look after us. So, you know, on the two ends of the spectrum of the AI possibilities, you've got Ian M. Banks' Culture Mines and
the Terminator.
Terminators.
Okay, somewhere in between, perhaps, will be okay.
So keep your answers to those questions coming into us, and we'll touch on them as we get towards the end of the hour. Okay, so we are in this apocalypse. We're starting to get some recovery. We've got our cars that we're driving around, we're making glass. Of course, we want to capture this somehow, capture the story of the recovery. And for all of those mad selfie-taking individuals out there, there is hope.
Again, aren't we?
There is hope. We could be taking selfies relatively quickly after this.
Yeah.
This
So again,
doomsday.
this was another of the kind of playful weekends I went through, of just actually seeing how something is made. Where does it come from? And you know, on the back of every book, there's always an author photograph, kind of a portrait where they're maybe kind of 3/4 onto camera, looking kind of ever so smug of himself because I did a whole book. Well, I wanted even the photo on the back of the book to remain true to the premise of the knowledge. I wanted to make a photo from scratch myself. I wanted to take a selfie in the deepest, most fundamental sense you could ever make a selfie, by making a photo
yourself.
myself. And I did that. So I went down to Lake Abbey in south of England, where photography was invented in the kind of 1830s, 1840s. I worked with an historian to mix together really simple, primitive, silver-containing chemistry, light, responsive chemistry, douse that emulsion onto a single plate of glass, the kind of thing I could have made myself on that kind of Robinson Crusoe experiment. Loaded that photographic plate into a primitive single-lens camera and had my photo taken, took a selfie. And what you've got by you there, Joe, is that photo that came out. This is my selfie that I've very egotistically since had framed.
I mean, I have to say, you do pull off the kind
So
of
there's
serious
two versions.
author.
Yeah.
So what you'll notice is that I'm not smiling in that picture. I look a little bit stern. And all the kind of earliest photographs of our ancestors, Victorian gentlemen, kind of Edwardian ladies, they look kind of joyless and very serious. And the reason for that is that this very simple silver-containing chemistry, very early photographic techniques, they're very slow to respond to light. So this isn't a snapshot, this isn't like click with your phone. This is a 15-second exposure. And I would challenge either of you or anyone watching to sit absolutely, perfectly still for 15 seconds, not allowing your facial muscles to relax, not allowing your shoulders to slump or your head to twitch, because the slightest motion of 15 seconds and your entire face blurs into this ghostly apparition, as happened for most of my selfies. So you can't smile. It's impossible to hold a natural smile for 15 seconds. So you have to just relax and hold a very neutral, almost kind of slightly stern and kind of unnatural looking pose. And also what you can't see is that behind me in this picture there is a wrought iron stand with a skull clamp locked into the base of my skull to hold my head absolutely perfectly still.
So you literally
for this
can't
picture.
move.
So you can't move. So that is why in my selfie I'm looking a little bit pissed off. But again, I love the idea of kind of going right back to basics and seeing how something is made. How do you make a photo? How do you exploit this almost magical chemistry and the only element that does that is silver. You can make, like blueprints come from iron compounds, which give you kind of a blue tint. The only way you can take like a photograph as you would imagine the word is with the really weird chemistry of silver, the metal silver. So I did that. I kind of, like I say, made my selfie from scratch, which was just, again, an enormous amount of fun of just kind of hacking about for this day and kind of looking behind the scenes of how things are made and where stuff comes from.
I mean, yeah, and a lot of hard work. I mean, your weekends, I have to say, your friends and family.
Well, that's either that or watch Narcos on Netflix, then, right?
Yeah.
You fill your time.
I mean, yeah, I have to, as someone who's just binged through the whole second season of
I'm still
Narcos.
enjoying spoilers.
No, I'll stop
I reckon there might be a couple more deaths amongst these drug dealers.
Yes, yeah. So before we jump in, we do have one more gateway technology we want to talk to us about. We've got a question from Nick from the audience, online audience. His question is that Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, suggested that the agricultural revolution was the worst thing that happened to mankind. Rather than liberating us, it enslaved us. We didn't domesticate corn, corn domesticated us. Next time around, should we remain hunter-gatherer?
So this is quite an old idea that agriculture was humanity's worst invention. It's total and utter rubbish. So
I hope you're not watching Yuval.
It is the case that hunter-gatherers had a more balanced, had a more varied diet. And at the very beginnings of agriculture, you saw signs of lots of kind of wear and tear on people's teeth, and it took a lot more effort to tend the land. But you could not have the world as we know it today with hunter-gathering. Like, farming and agriculture is so much more, phenomenally more productive at making food for people to eat out of the same area of land compared to hunter-gathering. You don't get towns, you don't get cities, you don't get all the kind of products of people working together in large numbers that we have today. So it has been fashionable in some times to imagine that agriculture was our worst invention. I would disagree. I think being able to eat reliably and not worrying about starving to death, or if there's some kind of drought and that the forest isn't creating our food for you.
We've got stocks, we can survive.
You can create surplus, exactly.
And
that was the very beginning of civilization, right? Was building these food surpluses and kind of granaries and then allowing a population increase.
And that efficiency, whole idea that I think in your book you say, we want to achieve 1 to 10, so one person's work can create food for 10 that then allows people to.
And those 10 now do something else. They're freed, they're liberated from the fields. They're
figuring
inventing
out how
stuff.
to
They're
get
researching. They're becoming nurses.
the selfie photo refined to the.
I mean, this is the the absolute pinnacle of hipster lifestyle, right? I'm starting the world from scratch, rebooting civilization. I'm not doing anything until I've got my selfies.
Get your photos sorted.
And I want a selfie stick to put my primitive single lens camera to hold for 15 seconds to get the backdrop.
Brilliant.
Okay, so one of your last bits and pieces you brought in to show us is really going back to that idea of knowledge, and actually retaining the knowledge will be the critical thing to the success of recovery post-apocalypse. And now today we have knowledge is bits and bobs and zeros and ones.
Bits and bobs. That's what we call them, bits and bobs.
That's a technical term that we call them. But you can store a huge number of books on Kindles and readers, for example. So you have a hack for this. You have a hack that could allow us to access this huge wealth of content via one device, even
after the apocalypse. Yeah. So again, the idea behind the book has got nothing to do with the end of the world. It's not about the zombies and the apocalypse. It's about our world and how it works, and trying to reconnect people with the technologies we've used. We kind of feel a bit disconnected from. But within this kind of thought experiment, if you did want to try and preserve all that we've accumulated, all that we've come to understand over hundreds of years and millennia, you might want to build some kind of total library. We kind of mentioned earlier, like this vast encyclopedia that records everything that we've worked out to make sure it's never lost to history again. We don't have another dark ages. But actually, like, kind of paper books are quite a bad way of preserving knowledge and understanding. They burn, they moulder if they get a bit damp. But with Kindles, with the e-readers we have today, you can hold in the palm of your hand an entire library of human knowledge. You can have 10,000 books in the palm of your hand. Problem with storing that, so having the knowledge and 9,999 other books stored on your e-reader, is that if this hypothetical apocalypse ever did arise and the grid goes down, you can't just simply plug your Kindle back into the wall. You can't recharge the batteries, you can't recharge your phone like we just take for granted today. So you'd have that really frustrating situation of having the sum total of human knowledge preserved in your hand, but no way of actually reading it anymore. The batteries are flat. So what I hacked in this final kind of weekend fun project I was saying was an apocalypse-proof Kindle. So this was a Kindle I got off eBay for like a tenner. It's a second-hand thing. I've got an old generation because I like the keyboard, and it's got this wonderful kind of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy mode where you can read out in this slightly robotic voice any text. It doesn't have to be a robot. So I've got like the Hitchhiker's Guide to Civilization with the knowledge loaded onto it, 9,999 other books.
Yeah.
And if the batteries ever go flat, you can just flip it over and leave it out in the sun and recharge it indefinitely. I've scavenged some old solar panels, wired them all together, used tabbing wire and kind of soldered it all together, fed that back round the front of the book and connected it in. So you've got this kind of like library of knowledge, this kind of book of human understanding in the palm of your hands, which again was like a great fun project.
And those solar panels, I mean, how long would they last?
So solar panels would last much, much longer than machinery. They don't wear out, they don't need kind of lubrication, there's no moving parts, but they do still deteriorate, and ironically they deteriorate in sunlight. So I did work this out, I looked this up, and I talk about that in chapter 1, like how long would antibiotics last for, how long would cans of food last for in a supermarket? How long could a supermarket feed a single person for before it all runs out? How long would solar panels keep operating? And you've got several decades. So the idea is, with this, if you took this seriously, you've got your library of human knowledge on this Kindle. As it starts deteriorating and the solar panels aren't working very well anymore, a couple of generations down the line as you're recovering your society, the knowledge, the book, tells you how to make paper and ink and a printing press. It can reproduce itself. So you access that information from here, and then you essentially download the digital information back via your printing press into physical hard copy books again. And you kind of recover that information before it's lost on here, and then copy it as many times as you need. But again, kind of tongue-in-cheek. The point of this book isn't about...
But it's about, I suppose, that idea of while we can leverage some of the legacy things that we have to really build up the infrastructure that will be more appropriate for something that we could maintain in the long run.
It's almost like a ladder system, starting from the ground and then slightly more...
Really put some thought into this. This is really becoming apparent as we go through this.
So
I was going to say that sense of, and talking about ladders, we're going to fall so far down that ladder, and this is there to make sure we don't fall too far.
Exactly.
What's the minimum we can fall
This is
before
it, and
starting
there's
on
a
this journey
wonderful
again?
line in John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids, which has got nothing to do with carnivorous plants. It is about society and how we work together and how you could stop yourself regressing too far after some kind of collapse and catch yourself back up. And you had a wonderful example, George, of 3D printers that someone had written about. Because I don't think we're quite there yet of having a database connected 3D printer that can print lots of different materials, like different metals, different kind of polymers and plastics. Because when we are then, probably in a couple of years away, you could have, if you took this seriously, a mountainside vault, like a vault to preserve humanity, and survivors could go there, maybe pass some kind of test to get through the door to prove they're kind of worthy and they're ready to have this information bestowed upon them. And there'd be a big red button on the wall of this vault, which would be like print civilization. And you push that button and you download the digitized information to the 3D printer, and it gives you a plow, and it gives you a harrow, and it gives you a lathe, and all the other different bits of machinery and tools that not only enable us to build a society, to keep a civilization going, but importantly, the tools that you use to repair each other. Like the tools we use are a network that kind of that maintain each other and can repair each other and make each other.
So you could self-sustaining,
self-interlinked, self-connected network. This kind of ecosystem of technology that we use. And I do love that idea you could compress that down, save it in a non-physical, non-material way, and just push a button and have a 3D printer make that for you. So Marcin Jakubowski is working on a project to do this called the Global Village Constructor Kit. So look that up, look up the book's website, there's links to that project on there, of this idea of the set of 50 tools that are all you need. They are the sum total of tools you would need to make each other.
And in your book, which is quite interesting, you were saying the tool, and you just mentioned them. Some of those tools now, you'd have to break into a museum to actually access.
Because they don't exist anymore. Because they've been kind of superseded.
So we'd be raiding the British Museum. Yeah.
Now there is a mental image. Leopard print clad savage barbarians of the future.
Don't forget the leather trousers. When you...
I think we're on the cusp of a new feature film here. You did mention just before, really quickly, maybe you mentioned how long a supermarket would feed us for, and I know you did some maths on that.
Yes, I calculated this. So I went to a supermarket, counted all the food that was there, divided by the amount you'd have to eat per day to survive, and I calculated that a single supermarket could support one person, could keep them alive for 55 years, or 63 years if you're happy to eat all the canned dog food and cat food as well. And I think by that point I would head straight to the booze aisle and just end it, quit thinking. I don't think I would eke out another 8 years waiting pedigree chum. But again, the frivolous example there, that the point behind that, behind that frivolity, is that the reason we no longer fear famine or the coming of winter in the modern world and developed nations is because we've worked out how to preserve food, how to stop it going off, how to stop bacteria and mold from eating it before a person. It's really it's the application of understanding.
It lasts decades and decades, right? So that's where we'd be hoarding tins of the answer. So just to get some answers to that earlier question. So Rosita Singh says, whatever be the cause, surely a section of #mutant population will survive. I will follow Bear Grylls survival tips. I will stay at home, make use of supplies, make my own electricity, hopefully, well, you know how to now. And one handy item would be a good old Swiss Army knife. I think that sounds like a pretty plausible solution. Just to remind you of the question, what were we asking? What were we actually
So we're asking people if they found themselves in two questions. First question, what do you think is the most likely cause of this potential apocalypse? Second question, if you found yourself in, say, a zombie apocalypse, where in the world would you go to? We've had people mostly mentioning tall buildings and small islands. So where in the world would you go to? Who would you take with you? We have Bear Grylls. No one has mentioned Ray Mears yet, so maybe he's not so popular. And we've also had Michael McIntyre, a comedian. So who would you take with you? And what single item would you take with you to ensure your survival? A paraglider being, for me, the most surprising. So there we go.
We've got jetpack as well here.
There you go.
I will bring my pet dog, Bruno. A dog? Would that be a useful
Dog would be helpful for
it's an
warning
extra
of,
mouth
of danger.
to feed, though.
It is.
Yeah,
But again, a common trope of things like I Am Legend. It's the kind of classic picture of Will Smith walking down the deserted street with his
Maybe for
dog
sanity you
behind
need,
him. Yeah, you want a companion, don't you?
Okay, there's a few more there. What would
let's
your
get your
answer
thoughts, Lewis.
to be to that?
So my single object, we've kind of hinted at it already. I talked about how the knowledge can replicate itself. It gives the instructions to make more books. And there's a machine that can replicate itself. There's a machine that can make all of the parts you need to make a second of that machine, and that is the lathe. And in fact, you can have a half-finished lathe that enables you to make the rest of the components you need to plug in to create an entire lathe. And there's an incredible example of a machinist who did that. He started with some sand, some old tin can, some aluminium metal, some charcoal for the fire, and he made himself a complete lathe from scratch in a kind of a matter of days by kind of pulling himself up from his bootstraps. And the amazing thing about a lathe, in particular the kind of screw thread you have in it, that if you don't have a screw thread to copy to other spirals, other screw threads, it's incredibly difficult to make the very, very first one. And that process took centuries of little tiny refinements, time on time. So if you could save only one thing and you wanted to leapfrog and make it easier to reboot again, just have a screw thread. You can make a lathe around, and then you can make any other lathe or any other machinery you need from that. But making the first screw thread is abnormally difficult.
Where would you be?
If I don't say the Isle of Wight, would you? I don't think it's got defensive capability, right?
Do you think not?
It's not that far off the mainland.
I have swam across it. So
Have you genuinely?
I have genuinely swum across it.
pretty
So
nippy.
yeah, you maybe need someone with more water around it.
So I like the idea of, like, if you, again, take this kind of thought experiment, this playful idea seriously, I'd go for an island because it's kind of isolated, but one that's big enough that would have all the natural resources you would need to keep yourself going, like a big enough forest you get firewood from, things you can kind of scavenge and use.
No, somewhere hot, would you be?
But not too hot though, right? So the climate's going to be quite important. You don't want to be kind of concerned about having enough drinking water or getting sunburnt the whole time.
And
You want to enjoy the
big
apocalypse,
one.
right?
I want to enjoy the apocalypse, yeah.
Who would
It's
you
wish
take?
fulfillment.
Who would you take with you? And like I said, no need to be sentimental. You got to survive this thing, okay?
So I think someone like Bear Grylls or kind of Ray Mears would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Like, so the book doesn't deal with that kind of survivalism and skinning a badger with your own teeth, but there would be a period when that would be quite helpful.
Okay.
Perfect. And so maybe finally, just to finish us off, the kind of big so what for people that are listening, going through the book, recognising we're very detached from a lot of the things that we use. We are maybe more vulnerable than we've ever been. What is your so what to people kind of tuning in, listening today?
Yeah, so as I said, the book isn't about the end of the world. It's a way of just exploring how things work today. And that in itself, I think, is a big, why the heck would anyone care? Because I think we are feeling disconnected. We can't even replace the batteries in our phone. So one thing the book does is kind of explore all of that, see where things come from and reconnect us with the technologies we use and just have kind of a bit of fun with it. So I hope if people take one thing away from this kind of chat we've been having, or maybe they're interested in explore the book's website or reading the book, just look again at things you use every day and just kind of ask yourself, where's that come from? What materials that use? What transport is that involved in its production? Where does it come from? Do I have even the foggiest idea how to go about doing that myself if I ever need to? We almost certainly won't. But just by kind of appreciating things a bit more, I think you enjoy and get much more satisfaction out of it.
Remain curious.
Remain curious, exactly.
And not taking things for granted.
Exactly.
It sounds as well.
And try and make friends with Bear Grylls
Yes.
if possible.
If either of you have got his email address, let me know.
Lewis, thank you very much.
Thanks,
that was
guys.
great, George.
Cheers.
Thank you very
Fantastic.
much.
Yeah, really, really good fun. Thank you.
And thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your comments. Very inspiring. At least we know where you will all be now in the case of an apocalypse. We can seek you out steal your baked beans and run away from Mike Tyson. So do tune in for the rest of the diff. There's more sessions later today. This is week 2. We run for 3 weeks, so there's loads more to come. And goodbye from us. See you all soon.